The tall glass windows of a stately home in Surrey cast long strips of light across the marble floor. Inside, 6-year-old Emily Whitmore sat cross-legged on the carpet, arranging her dolls in a circle. Her golden hair caught the glow of the late afternoon sun, but her blue eyes were strangely vacant. The grand house felt heavy with silence. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the heating system could be heard. Emily bent close to one of the dolls and whispered, "Daddy will be home soon. Maybe today he'll play with us." Yet even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Edward Whitmore, her father, was the celebrated chief executive of one of London's most powerful technology firms. At 40, he had built a business empire that newspapers praised endlessly. But while investors cheered, his little girl lived in a world starved of attention. Luxury filled every room, but warmth was absent. Emily didn't need another expensive toy. What she longed for was a father's hug, one that lasted longer than a rushed goodnight kiss. Footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Mrs. Green, the long-serving housekeeper, appeared, her face tired yet kind. "Emily, it's time for your snack." "I'm not hungry," Emily murmured. "I just want Daddy." Mrs. Green sighed and gestured around at the gleaming furniture. "Your father works hard to give you all of this." But Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "I don't want things, I just want him." Several nannies had already resigned in the past months. Emily wasn't difficult. She was simply desperate for affection. Suddenly the heavy front door opened earlier than usual. Edward stepped inside, his suit creased, tie loosened, eyes clouded with exhaustion. Before he could speak, Emily rushed towards him, her voice bursting with hope. "Daddy, you're home early." For a fleeting second, Edward shed the armor of a corporate leader. He lifted her into his arms, inhaling the scent of her shampoo. "Hello, Princess. How was your day?" "Boring. Mrs. Green wanted me to practice piano, but I wanted to go to the park. Will you take me?" He glanced at his watch. Deadlines, emails, board meetings crowded his thoughts. Yet the look in his daughter's eyes made him hesitate. When had he last taken her somewhere just for fun? After a long pause, he nodded. Emily squealed with joy, her laughter echoing down the cold hallway. For the first time in months, Edward felt more like a father than a CEO. That evening they arrived at Hyde Park. The late sun bathed the grass in gold. Children shouted with laughter. A busker strummed his guitar near the path. Emily darted towards the climbing frame, fearless and full of energy. Edward sat on a bench, deliberately leaving his phone in his pocket, forcing himself to look only at her. Yet guilt stabbed at him. How many such moments had he already missed? When hunger nudged, he walked towards a food stall for a sandwich. Behind him, Emily's attention drifted elsewhere. On a nearby bench sat a woman, alone, shoulders hunched, her hands tightly clasped as though holding herself together. Emily, unafraid in her innocence, approached and asked softly, "Why are you sad?" That small question, so simple, so childlike, was the spark that would alter the lives of 3 strangers forever. The woman on the bench blinked in surprise. A child's clear voice had broken through the fog of her thoughts. She raised her head, startled, and found herself looking into the wide, curious eyes of a little girl with golden hair. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she whispered, "Oh, hello. I'm not sad, just thinking." Her name was Sarah Collins, 27 years old, though in that moment she felt much older. Only that morning, she had been dismissed from her job at a small cafe in Camden. It was her 3rd job lost in less than 6 months. This time, the excuse was trivial. She had stood up to a customer who made crude remarks. Instead of protecting her, the manager told her she was too difficult and asked her to leave. It was not the first time life had been unfair. Sarah rented a modest flat in a worn-down street of East London, struggling each month to cover the bills. Her parents had passed when she was still young, and since her teenage years she had shouldered responsibility for two younger siblings. She had never been afraid of hard work, but lately, no matter how hard she tried, doors seemed to close in her face. She had come to Hyde Park simply because she didn't know where else to go. Sitting on that bench, she had been staring at the grass, wondering how long she could keep her flat before eviction became inevitable. Behind her calm expression hid a storm of worry. Fear of failure, fear of being forgotten, fear of always being alone. And then, out of nowhere, this little girl appeared and wrapped her arms around her. The warmth of that small hug unlocked something Sarah hadn't felt in years. Her eyes stung as tears threatened to escape. "You're very sweet," she murmured, brushing her cheek quickly with the back of her hand. "What's your name?" "Emily," the girl replied proudly, settling onto the bench beside her. "You look like you need a hug." Sarah laughed softly. An unsteady, surprised laugh. Who was this child, so direct and fearless? For an instant, the emptiness inside her eased. Emily tilted her head. "Do you have children?" Sarah shook her head, caught off guard by the question. "No. But I helped raise my little brother and sister. They're grown now." The girl nodded as if considering something important.
Then she smiled. "You smell like flowers. My dad always smells like his office." The innocence of that remark forced another laugh out of Sarah, though her chest ached. How long had it been since anyone had spoken to her with such honesty? Before she could answer further, a strong voice echoed across the park. "Emily, where are you?" Sarah turned and saw a man in shirt sleeves, his suit trousers still creased from the office. His presence was commanding, yet beneath the authority lay a flicker of fatigue. His eyes widened in relief as he spotted his daughter, then narrowed slightly when he noticed the stranger beside her. "Emily, you can't just run off," he said firmly, though his tone was not unkind. Then, looking at Sarah, he added more cautiously, "I hope my daughter hasn't been bothering you." Sarah stood quickly, shaking her head. "Not at all. She's a delightful child." Emily clutched her father's hand with one small fist and Sarah's with the other, refusing to let go. Her voice rang out with innocent determination. "Daddy, this is Sarah. She made me feel better when I was sad. And she needs a job. Can she come work with us?" The air between them seemed to freeze. Edward's face flushed, caught between embarrassment and surprise. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What on earth had this child just said?
What none of them knew in that instant was that Emily's innocent words would set in motion a chain of events that would test every bond of trust, loyalty, and love. Edward Whitmore stood tall, his shoulders still squared as though he had just stepped out of a boardroom. Yet in that moment, standing in Hyde Park with his daughter gripping one hand and a stranger gripping the other, he looked utterly unprepared. "Emily," he muttered, his cheeks coloring, "you mustn't say things like that. It's not polite." But Emily didn't flinch. Her bright blue eyes gleamed with conviction. "You always tell me to help people when we can. Sarah needs help. And you need someone too, Daddy." Her words struck harder than Edward wanted to admit. He cleared his throat, dragging his gaze from the young woman before him. Sarah's appearance was simple: a plain blouse, a cardigan slightly frayed at the sleeves, and shoes that had seen better days. Yet there was something about her. An honesty in her eyes, a warmth in her smile, that unsettled him far more than any corporate rival ever could. "I'm sorry," Edward said awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. "She's very direct. I hope she hasn't embarrassed you." Sarah shook her head, managing a small smile. "Not at all. She's extraordinary." Emily tightened her grip on their hands, refusing to release either. "Daddy, next week is your birthday. Can Sarah come? Then you won't be so lonely." The sentence hung in the evening air like a bell's chime, impossible to ignore. Edward froze, staring at his daughter. "Lonely." Did she truly see him that way? The thought lodged painfully in his chest. Sarah felt her face flush hot. She hadn't meant to intrude on this family's life, hadn't expected to be pulled into it by a child's innocent words. Yet something in Emily's hopeful gaze made it impossible to simply step back. "I really don't want to impose," Sarah said gently, trying to untangle her hand from Emily's, but the girl held on tightly, determined. Edward exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He glanced once more at Sarah, at the tired curve of her shoulders, at the faint determination still lingering in her eyes. Against all reason, he found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. "If you're free, you're welcome to join us, only if you wish, of course." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his sudden formality. "Are you sure?" Edward gave a slight nod, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his uncertainty. "It seems my daughter has already made up her mind." Emily beamed, bouncing on her heels. "See, she'll come. It will be perfect." On the walk back to Edward's car, Emily never let go of Sarah's hand. She chatted endlessly. About school, about her dolls, about how she wanted to be a vet when she grew up. Edward listened in silence, his mind whirring. He had spent years keeping his life ordered, structured, predictable. Yet within the space of 1 hour in Hyde Park, a stranger had stepped into their world and unsettled the balance. And as Sarah glanced at the looming silhouette of Edward's grand house on the Surrey hillside, she felt a chill of awe and fear. She had no place in such a world, but Emily clung to her as though she belonged there already. Neither of them realized that what had begun as a chance meeting on a park bench was about to turn into a connection that none of them could easily undo. The following evening, Sarah stood at the iron gates of the Whitmore estate in Surrey. The house rose before her like a silent monument, glass and stone gleaming in the twilight, proud but strangely unwelcoming. Her hands trembled as she pressed the buzzer. Moments later, the heavy door swung open. Emily burst out, racing down the steps, her little arms thrown wide. "You came! I told Daddy you would!" Sarah laughed, the sound nervous but genuine, as the child clung to her waist. Behind her, Edward appeared. He wore a dark suit, freshly pressed, the kind of attire that signaled he belonged more to boardrooms than to family rooms. His face was guarded, though his eyes betrayed something else, an odd flicker of relief. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, his voice quieter than she expected. Inside, the Whitmore house was everything Sarah had imagined and more. High ceilings, marble floors, expensive paintings gazing down from the walls. Yet the vast rooms felt hollow, like a gallery where life itself had been locked away. Sarah shivered slightly. Luxury had never seemed so cold. Emily, however, filled the silence with her chatter. She dragged Sarah into the living room, spreading a pile of colorful drawings across the table. "Look, I made these for Daddy, but he was always too busy to see them. What do you think?" Edward froze at the words, his breath catching. Each sketch was clumsy but bursting with color. Houses, animals, stick figures holding hands, all the things his daughter wanted but couldn't quite name. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes shining. "These are wonderful, Emily. You have real talent. I'd love to see more." The little girl beamed, climbing onto Sarah's lap as if it were the most natural place in the world. Watching them, Edward felt a pang deep in his chest, a mixture of shame and longing. He had never managed to create that effortless warmth. Later, after Emily had been tucked into bed, Sarah lingered in the drawing room. She considered excusing herself, but Edward spoke first, his tone unexpectedly soft. "She opened up to you more in one evening than she has to anyone in months. For that, thank you." Sarah glanced at him, uncertain. Children don't need much, just someone to listen, someone who really sees them. I suppose I understand that after raising my younger brother and sister. Her words struck him. For years, he had surrounded himself with people, investors, managers, assistants, yet rarely did anyone speak to him without pretense. With Sarah, there was no calculation, no flattery, only honesty. He hesitated, then said something he hadn't planned. "Would you consider working here? Not permanently, just on a trial basis, to help Emily. She trusts you." Sarah's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." But his gaze held steady. "I am. Emily needs more than I can give her alone, and perhaps so do I." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Sarah's heart thudded. She had walked into this house as a stranger, intending to stay for an evening. Now she was being asked to step into a life that wasn't hers. At last she whispered, "If it helps her, I'll try." Edward nodded, though his mind spun. He had just opened a door he wasn't sure he could ever close again. By the end of the first week, the Whitmore household no longer felt the same. Where once the grand halls of the Surrey estate had echoed with emptiness, now they rang with laughter. Emily's giggles drifted through the corridors, carried on games Sarah invented, building blanket forts in the drawing room, playing hide and seek among the rose bushes, humming silly songs while Emily practiced piano. Sarah had a way of turning chores into play. Homework became a treasure hunt, piano practice a guessing game of familiar tunes. Even Mrs. Green, the weary housekeeper who had grown used to sullen silence, began to smile when she heard Emily's bubbling voice. Edward noticed the change immediately. Returning home late one evening, he paused in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, as he heard something that stopped him cold. Emily was laughing, a deep, unrestrained laugh he hadn't heard in years. He stood quietly, watching from the hall as Sarah knelt on the carpet, drawing silly faces with Emily, both of them grinning as though the rest of the world didn't exist. A strange ache filled his chest. For so long he had provided wealth, education, security. But it was Sarah who had given his daughter the one thing money couldn't buy: joy. That night, as Emily slept, Edward lingered downstairs. Sarah was tidying crayons into a box when he spoke. "She hasn't laughed like that in a very long time," he said softly. Sarah looked up, brushing hair from her face. "Children don't need perfection. They just need to feel safe, to know someone's really there." Her words lingered. Edward found himself searching her face longer than he meant to. She wasn't polished, not like the partners and investors who filled his business dinners. She was real. There was a warmth in her that slipped past the armor he had built around himself. Over the following days, he began to stay home a little longer. He turned down one late meeting, postponed another. It felt reckless, even dangerous, to let go of his rigid routine. Yet when Emily tugged at his hand to show him a drawing and Sarah laughed in the background, Edward realized he wasn't missing anything important in those boardrooms. What mattered was happening right here. But with that realization came something more unsettling. The way his gaze lingered on Sarah when she laughed at Emily's jokes. The way his mind replayed the sound of her voice long after she had left the room. The way every accidental brush of her hand sent a ripple through the walls he had sworn never to lower again. He told himself it was only gratitude. He told himself Emily's happiness was the only reason, but late at night, alone in his study, he could no longer deny the truth. He was beginning to feel something he had never expected, something he wasn't sure he had the right to feel. And yet, as the days slipped into weeks, one thing became clear. Emily was no longer the only one who needed Sarah. The Whitmore estate glowed like a beacon on the night of Edward's 40th birthday. Cars lined the sweeping drive, headlights cutting through the dusk as London's elite stepped out in gowns and tailored suits. Waiters moved briskly through the halls, balancing silver trays of champagne. A pianist played softly in the corner, his music weaving through the chatter of investors, politicians, and old family acquaintances. Edward, as always, looked the part of a man in control, immaculate in a black suit, his expression measured. To most guests, it was just another display of wealth, another celebration of success. But tonight was different. For the first time, Sarah was in the room. She had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on a simple navy dress. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried an understated grace. When she entered the hall, Emily ran to her, clutching her hand and beaming with pride as if to declare to the entire gathering, "This is my person. She belongs here." Heads turned. Whispers began. Who was this young woman no one recognized? Some guests assumed she was a new business partner. Others speculated in hushed tones that Edward, long widowed and fiercely private, had finally let someone into his guarded world. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, but she stood steady. She introduced herself politely, smiled when spoken to, and refused to shrink beneath the scrutiny. From across the room, Edward watched, something like pride stirring in his chest. Later, as glasses were raised and the piano hushed, Edward stepped forward for his annual speech. Usually he spoke of profits, market growth, and duty. But as he glanced over the sea of faces, his eyes landed on Sarah, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, Emily's small hand entwined with hers. "This year," he began slowly, his voice steady, "success has not been my greatest gift. My daughter has found her laughter again, and for that I am grateful. Grateful to someone who reminded us what it means to truly be present." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Edward's gaze lingered on Sarah a beat too long. She flushed crimson, lowering her eyes. And then, before the silence could settle, Emily stepped boldly into the center of the room. Her small voice rang out, clear and innocent. "Daddy should marry Sarah. Then she can be my mummy." The room froze. It was as if the pianist's fingers had struck air. Conversations halted mid-word, champagne glasses hung suspended. Dozens of eyes swung towards Edward, then Sarah, then the little girl who had spoken the unspoken truth. Some guests stifled laughter. Others whispered, their curiosity blazing. Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks, her breath caught. She wanted to sink into the floor. Edward stood rooted, his glass half raised, his world spinning. Emily looked up at him, her face glowing with hope, as though her innocent declaration was the most natural solution in the world. In that breathless moment, every wall Edward had built over years of discipline threatened to crumble. He met Sarah's eyes, saw warmth, fear, and something else, something that mirrored the longing inside him. It lasted only a heartbeat, but the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The applause that followed Edward's speech never quite recovered from Emily's outburst. Guests had smiled politely, some even laughed, but the undercurrent was undeniable. The Whitmores had been exposed in a way society would not forget soon. When the last of the champagne glasses had been cleared and the final car rolled down the drive, silence fell heavy over the Surrey estate. Edward paced the drawing room, his mind still replaying the words his daughter had shouted into the world. Sarah sat at the edge of a chair, her dress wrinkled from the long evening, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt as though she had been dropped into a storm, not of her making. Emily had fallen asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the whirlwind she had unleashed. "She's just a child," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "She doesn't understand what she's asking." Edward stopped pacing. His gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again, as though he was wrestling with himself. "She understands more than you think. She sees me as I am, lonely. And she sees you as what she's been missing." Sarah shook her head, her throat tight. "I can't be what she wants me to be. I was never supposed to be here. I'm just..." She hesitated, searching for words. "I'm just her nanny." Edward flinched at that word. Just her nanny. It felt like a dismissal of everything Sarah had become in their lives. But he couldn't argue, not yet. For the next few days, the house was filled with an uneasy quiet. Emily, oblivious, carried on as though Sarah's place in the family was already permanent. She clung to her at bedtime, insisted Sarah sit beside her at meals, whispered to her in moments of childish worry. To Emily, the declaration at the party had not been scandal, it had been truth. But beneath the surface, tension grew. Edward found himself watching Sarah when he shouldn't, wondering what it would mean to step beyond gratitude into something more dangerous. Sarah, meanwhile, felt the stares of the household staff, heard the whispers of society outside the estate. Doubt gnawed at her, and then, without warning, the past returned. It happened on a grey morning, mist rolling low across the Surrey fields. The iron gates buzzed, and Mrs. Green hurried breathlessly into Edward's study. "Sir, there's someone at the gate. She says she's here to see Emily." Edward frowned, rising from his chair. When he stepped into the entrance hall, his breath caught. There, standing beneath the archway, was a woman draped in a tailored coat, her expression cold, her eyes sharp with calculation. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Edward," she said smoothly, "I've come back for my daughter." It was Victoria Hale, Emily's biological mother, the woman who had vanished years ago, leaving Edward to pick up the pieces. Emily, descending the stairs with Sarah's hand in hers, froze at the sight. She didn't recognize the woman before her, not really, but instinct told her what words could not. Sarah instinctively drew Emily closer, her arm protective, her heart hammering. "I don't want to go with her," Emily whispered, her small fingers gripping Sarah's sleeve. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "She's my child. And you?" Her gaze cut to Sarah, sharp as glass. "You have no claim." The air in the hall grew thick with dread. The fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered. The news of Victoria Hale's return spread quickly. For years she had been absent, silent, unreachable, yet now she stood before the Whitmores as though nothing had happened. Within days, letters arrived carried by solicitors. She was petitioning for custody of Emily. Edward read the papers in grim silence. The accusations were brutal. Victoria's lawyers painted him as an absent father, a man too consumed by business to provide real care. They dismissed Sarah entirely, portraying her as nothing more than an opportunist clinging to wealth. Every word was designed to wound. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she read the claims. "She says I'm only here for money," she whispered, her eyes stinging. Edward took the paper from her and threw it aside. "She lies. Emily knows the truth." But Sarah's doubts ran deep. Legally, she was no one, no blood tie, no rights, The fear that Emily could be torn from her arms was almost unbearable. Emily too felt the storm. She clung to Sarah at night, whispering fiercely, "I don't want to go with her. You're my mummy now." When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom in London was filled to the brim. Journalists lurked outside, hungry for scandal. Inside, the judge, a stern woman with silver hair, took her seat. Victoria rose first, her words polished, her tone cold. "This man," she said, pointing at Edward, "left our daughter to be raised by staff. And this woman," she gestured sharply at Sarah, "is nothing but a stranger in our home. A child belongs with her mother." Her voice echoed with confidence, but Sarah felt every syllable like a lash. She lowered her eyes, her chest tight with shame she didn't deserve. Then Edward stood. His voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it. "Yes, I worked too much. I sacrificed more than I should have. But I never abandoned my daughter. And as for Sarah, she has given Emily something neither wealth nor titles could ever provide." She gave her laughter back. The judge's eyes flickered, but it wasn't enough. The argument circled, sharp and relentless. And then, in a moment of quiet, the judge leaned down to Emily. "Emily," she asked gently, "do you want to tell me where you would like to live?" The courtroom fell utterly silent. Emily took a breath, her small voice ringing clear. "With Daddy. And with Sarah. Because Sarah reads me stories. She dries my tears. She makes me happy. She is my mummy." The words sliced through the room with the purity only a child could hold. Victoria's face paled. The courtroom stirred with whispers. Sarah's hand covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. The judge nodded slowly. "Then it is decided. Custody remains with Edward Whitmore. Sarah Collins is to be recognized formally as Emily's guardian.
Miss Hale will be granted supervised visitation and nothing more." The gavel struck. It was done. Emily ran straight into Sarah's arms, clinging as though she would never let go. Edward, his eyes glassy with relief, placed a steady hand on Sarah's shoulder. For the first time in years, hope filled the room instead of loneliness. Weeks later, in the quiet of spring, Edward led Sarah back to Hyde Park, where it had all begun.
Emily played on the grass nearby as Edward, nervous in a way he never was at board meetings, pulled a small box from his pocket. "Sarah," he said softly, "you've given us more than I ever knew we needed. You turned this house into a home. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. Before she could answer, Emily shouted across the field, laughing, "Say yes, Mummy. Please say yes." And Sarah did. Their wedding was simple, nothing like the grand parties Edward had once hosted. Just family, close friends, and the sound of Emily scattering flower petals down the aisle. In that quiet chapel, when Edward and Sarah exchanged vows, it wasn't just a union of two adults, it was the sealing of a family, born not of blood but of choice, love and trust. Victoria disappeared from their lives, though her shadow lingered at the edges. But Emily no longer feared being left. She knew where she belonged. And in the evenings, when Edward tucked her in and Sarah kissed her forehead, Emily would whisper the words she had waited years to say. "Mummy." The house in Surrey was no longer silent. It breathed with laughter, with warmth, with the promise of a new beginning. A family, rebuilt from brokenness, stronger than before.